Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jamison Cable, and we're going to continue our discussion about James Harrod with David Kirkpatrick. When did it become Harrodsburg? I mean, was it just a few years, or was it a little bit longer? Because it was Harrodstown.
There's some land. It's also called Old Town for a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
There's some land affidavits from some of Harrod's original settlers. I think Abraham Chaplin is one of the guys they interview, and they ask him that same question: when did this place called Harrodsburg? And according to him, it was almost immediately. It's Harrodstown for a short period of time, and you see that on maps for a few years.
Yeah.
But it's very early on. Within the first decade, it's made that transition from Harrodstown to Harrodsburg.
Well, and that's what I was thinking. Is the maps I've looked at, there's a few that's Harrodstown, and then it's Harrodsburg.
Right.
I mean, I'm thinking like the first. There's a map of 76 and the map of 78 or something like that. But pretty quickly it becomes Harrodsburg. So that's what happens. That's how it goes, I guess. Names change.
That's right.
And Harrodsburg, basically, when does it become incorporated, though? It doesn't become incorporated immediately, or is it a little bit after?
Yeah, it's a while after that. And as a matter of fact, this is the cause of a little bit of friendly rivalry, because Danville, if you visit Danville, which is a beautiful city, you'll see on their water tower, first city in Kentucky. And as far as places of settlement, Harrodsburg is undisputably the first. But as far as chartered, cities actually approved by the legislature, Danville was approved before Harrodsburg. So
that's like those Bardstown people claiming to be the second town. Stanford people. Stanford is number 2.
Old St. Asaph's, that's right. But yeah, it's a while before they do that. But the town is growing in leaps and bounds. And I would say Harrodsburg, in the 1780s is probably the most power that it's ever felt, because you have other settlers coming in. And it seems like a random spot for Harrod to pick, but as proof of what a good decision it was, when they get back from the Battle of Point Pleasant and Lord Dunmore's War, one of the things they have to contend with They come down the Ohio, they come up to Kentucky just like before. They land their canoes in the same spot. They're marching to Harrodsburg, and they're part of the way there, and they hear voices speaking English. And so everyone kind of looks at each other and panics. And there's a group of people at a place from the man named McAfee. And McAfee Station, if you're driving Highway 127, you'll see the markers for it. There were another group of people who, again, had been with Harrod and Bullitt when they had surveyed what would become Louisville. And McAfee, completely separate of Harrod, had scouted the area and said, this is the place to be. And so there's this quick powwow where we got to figure some stuff out because they hadn't overlapped their land claims yet, but they were extremely, extremely close. So McAfee's folks are just south of Salvisa. And so if you know the area very well, central Kentucky, I mean, that's extremely close to Harrodsburg when you're handing out hundreds of acres at a time, you know. And so they have to have this agreement about what's going on. And so many guys came through there. Isaac Height, who's going to play a big role in settlement of Jefferson County and places like that. John Floyd visits Harrodsburg. Simon Kenton visits Harrodsburg. Daniel Boone spends the winter at a cave in Harrodsburg. His brother Squire lives at Harrodsburg for a period of months. And looks like I think he was there in the siege in 1777. So it's a popular place.
Yeah, and getting into more of just what was going on in the area, you think about, well, at the time when we're talking about them debating with Boone and Henderson and all those, Harrodsburg would probably have been the most populated place at the time, in the whole state.
I think so.
So then on top of that, though, it's funny when you go back and look at some of these early first towns. You got Stanford, you got Harrodsburg, McClellan's, Leestown. You got those places, and whenever you're reading a lot of those things, excuse me, especially or whenever you're reading those old kind of documents or the Kentucky Encyclopedia, you find those places would retreat, and definitely in 1777. The places they would retreat back to would be Harrodsburg. That was the central, or the central location, or the all is good. If we're having trouble, we need to get to Harrodsburg. If trouble's brewing, Harrodsburg's the best place to be. And it goes to show, like you said, that just the location was very well picked.
And you mentioned McClellan's, and that's a great example because McClellan's is modern day Georgetown. So you think how far by car, and of course it makes a little more sense to them because they're traveling waterways, and so you've got the Kentucky River you can get to quickly, but at the same time that's a distance to go, and the fact that when it's attacked in 1777, you're right, the leader is killed, and his widow and the other, I forget how many people were in the fort. It was a smaller fort. Their plan is we've got to get to Harrodsburg, and they're escorted by the few militia in the state, and they make it there and spend not quite a year there before they branch back out and start again. But yeah, it was a place of safety for early Kentuckians.
Yep. So yeah, a lot of Native American attacks, though. The siege in 1777. Now Simon Kenton is in that one. Is that the one he's in where he climbs the fence or climbs the walls and gets the deer?
I think that's right. Yep.
Yeah.
And that starts out kind of tragic. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say good old Simon Kenton.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Simon Kenton really doesn't get enough play either, in my opinion. And of course, you get the Frontiersman, which helps a little bit by Alan Eckert.
That does.
But I mean, there needs to be more work done on him. But the siege at Harrodsburg is really different compared to Boonesboro. You have this massive battle at Boonesboro, and in Harrodsburg, it really starts out kind of tragically because there's a journal that was kept by a settler at that time for the spring and summer and recounts what's going on. And Hugh McGarry, who you either love him or hate him, poor Hugh was an early settler in Kentucky and who did really a lot for the state. If there was a civil office that needed to be filled, Hugh did it. And, you think of that being maybe a glamorous thing. Well, it wasn't back then. I mean, you're giving time away from your farm and your settlement. So Hugh was willing to give of himself a lot. But Hugh also had a reputation for maybe a bad temper. And he had sent his two boys, and there was a third boy who I think remains unnamed. And I should take that back. They're his two stepsons. So they'll get different surnames. And a third boy. And they went out with Mr. Coons, the husband of William Coons, husband of the first school teacher there. And they're clearing out some land.
Let me clarify. First school teacher in Kentucky, Jane Coombs.
That's right. And if you want to see the little cabin she would have had, you go in Fort Harrod, they
It's
still have a
there.
cabin
Yep.
dedicated. And the courting to when you go there, they got a triangle hanging up, which probably what they would have had later on. But the story goes the first bell she had was an old cowbell that had been surrendered by its owner, and that's how she called people to school. So talk about
That's pretty cool.
resourcefulness. Yeah, use what you have. But they're out at Shawnee Springs, which is right on the river in northern Mercer County, and they're trying to clear out some land, and the boys decide to take a break, and they're drinking some sugar water, and there's an attack, and they do their best to make it back. One of the boys makes it, the other does not, and they get inside the fort, and McGarry, quite understandably, is pretty livid. Um, he approaches Harrod, and he said, "I can't believe you didn't have pickets sent out, or you didn't have guards sent out, or you weren't patrolling the area." And he said, "I'm leaving right now, and I'm taking men with me, and we're going to catch the Indians that killed my son." And Harrod says, "It's really not a good idea. If there's that large a party of Shawnee warriors to weaken the fort, we had best stay here, because you still have Mr. Coombs out there. William Coombs hasn't come back. I don't think the third boy has made it back. They assume the one boy is injured or captured or dead. They don't know. And so the only person who made it back to that party of 4 is this young lad." And it escalates. And, McGarry is upset, understandably. And he yells at Boone, "If you were any kind of a leader, you would have done things differently." Or
Harrod.
yelled at Harrod, sorry. And, Harrod, "I'm not taking that." And guns are drawn. And finally, they're standing inside the fort, and there's this tense standoff. And Mrs. McGarry comes up and said, "Let's not." She's already figuring she's lost one son. So Harrod relents. They send a group of guys out, and they find the body, and they realize really the situation they're in. And then it would be, the next day, I think they saw a cabin on fire in the distance. And so they go out to see, they send a party of men out to check on that. And they realize the huge body of Indians had got between them and the fort. And someone at the fort had noticed and called out to them. And so they have to kind of sneak their way back to the fort, and tree by tree, until they get close enough to run for the gates. And so it's not at all the same kind of battle that you see at Boonesboro, but it's every bit as dire, and lasts throughout the summer of 1777, and made quite an impression.
And the year of 1777, known as the Bloody Sevens, was hard on all factors of dealings in Kentucky. But yeah, pretty rough time. So that many, I mean, there's many stories and so forth about Native American battles, sieges, forts, and those sorts of stuff. But that would probably be one of the most important at Harrodsburg, maybe. At least a standing fort, kind of Stanford one. I'm trying to think. Each fort, I'm sure at some point had to deal with a siege. But it's amazing too how sometimes, like, you think these big sieges to be this big battle, but there's really not as many casualties as you might think. But
Right.
One part of Herod's life that we've not really brought up at all, but mainly because it hadn't happened. He gets married
He does.
to Anne Coburn McDaniel.
McDaniel. Ann Coburn McDaniel. Yep.
And she's actually a widow. Has her son, or her husband had been killed by Native Americans, but she has a son, ironically named James. So her and then they have a daughter. They have a daughter together, correct?
Yes. And poor Anne, she comes to Kentucky with her parents and her husband, and they're here a very short time, pass through Fort Harrod, which is Harrod's first acquaintance with them. And her father is killed not long after they're in Kentucky. Her husband is killed, and they end up, I think, down your way, for a time.
Yeah.
And they're residing down there, and Harrod, took a fancy to her and begins visiting and courting her, and they marry in 1778. So it's still the thick of the Revolution. Probably the height of it for Harrodsburg is 1777. So things have calmed down just a little bit. But she has been in Kentucky a very short time. I already lost so many people, and will later, lose her son to a similar tragedy. So, but yes, 1785, I was going to say 86, but it's 85. Herod and Anne have their only child, who is Margaret,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
they raise her there. And Herod tries very hard. At one point, Herod tries to build sort of a fancier school at Boiling Springs. There's a Latin school, they called it, and teaching the finer things. But Indian raids just made it impossible to keep that up. But Anne does meet her future husband at the school, or Margaret, excuse me. Margaret meets her future husband at the school. So there's that. But yet, his life seems to be progressing.
Mm-hmm. Who is Margaret's future husband?
John Fauntleroy. And
Okay.
my only, it's a different name. My only problem with John is they interviewed John in like 30 years later. He dies in the 1840s.
Oh,
And
wow. Yeah.
he has he's living in Missouri at this point, and he has Herod's original order book. He's got the diary that all the guys went down in that's referenced. He said, "Oh yeah, I've got that. That's no problem." And then he dies a year or 2 years later, and it disappears. So the holy grail of Mercer County research. I've tried to contact people in Virginia. I've called the state archives stuff. I said, "You don't happen to have this really old book, do you?" And of course, someone probably threw it out. But yeah, so
Man, come on, people, read your old junk.
oh, absolutely. Find somebody else who wants it at least. That's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping somebody has it preserved somewhere and that maybe it'll show back up. But yeah, Kentucky County is abolished in 1780, and you get the three big counties. So you get Jefferson County, Fayette County, and Lincoln. And Harrodsburg is still the county seat of Lincoln County at this point, which is all of southern Kentucky and most of western Kentucky.
It's massive.
Except for the post. So, Harrod is made a colonel in the militia. He serves on the board of trustees for Harrodsburg for a little bit. But Harrod, doesn't seem – he's an odd duck because he doesn't have the wanderlust that Boone has. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he doesn't have the political fortunes that someone like Isaac Shelby has, who's been here all this time as well. And the Shelbys knew the Harrods even. They had a connection where the Shelbys lived in western Maryland. So he seems content to play his part to some degree, but he doesn't show that interest in the limelight. And of course, he participates throughout the rest of the war. The launching off for the George Rogers Clark's, conquest of the Illinois Territory, where he takes most of the forts out there from the British during the American Revolution, that jumps off from Harrodsburg. Harrod marches a relief party once. They sent 500 pounds of gunpowder down the Ohio River, and the communications got messed up. There was no party waiting to get it, so they hid it in 5 or 6 different places and rushed to Fort Harrod to tell Harrod, and he goes north to get the badly needed powder. So he's done that through the war. He's performed some civic duties, with the town, but he is really happy at Boiling Springs, away from it all. And now he has his wife, and by 85, his daughter, and he seems pretty contented.
Yeah. He's a representative, I think, in 1779 for Virginia. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way it goes. He's kind of living or settling into a calmer kind of life. As more settlements, grow or pop up, the less Native American attacks, those kind of things are dying down. As you talk about, Lincoln County and Harrodsburg being the county seat. I mean, that's kind of I guess you mapped it out pretty good. I mean, things are kind of just dying down, and he's kind of settling into his older age. Because at this time, I'm not the best to do the math right off the top of my head, but he's at least in his 40s or older. If somebody else wants to do the math, they can do it. But he's getting into that later stage of life. But tragedy comes back to the door. Again, we talked about his stepson, James, who he took in a pretty good, took him in as his own. I mean, he didn't wasn't the, any kind of stereotypical stepson situation. I think he was pretty fond with him and so forth. But his stepson, James, is captured by Native Americans and then burned at the stake in 1787. So we kind of did a little bit of a time jump there, but pretty rough moment, a pretty rough time for anybody, but definitely for Harrod. Losing somebody close to you in that type of manner would be tough for anybody.
Oh, absolutely. And you're right. He's beginning to feel the effects of age. He is not at the Battle of the Blue Licks. There's a contingent of guys from Harrodsburg that are there, but Harrod has got back problems, and he said, "I simply can't ride. I can't make the ride." So Harrod's not at the most famous battle in the Revolution in Kentucky because of that. So he's beginning to feel his age there. Tragedy struck. You're right. And he's also like so many of these early guys. If you live long enough and you're a Kentucky settler, you're going to be sued over land issues. And there are court cases after court cases where Harrod is trying to maintain his land. Either he's the plaintiff or he is the defendant. And famous names: Daniel Boone, of course, we mentioned I think in a previous episode. John Crow, the guy who ends up settling Danville. Harrod tries to claim part of the land that would become Danville. So just figuring out exactly where these land patents, and if you've ever read a Kentucky land grant, it's abundantly clear why they have trouble with it, because it's down by the oak tree and then left 40 rods, the 2 birch trees.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Oh,
So,
and if you think the land grants are bad too, go read a county lines. Like the county lines are done the same way.
yeah.
Runs across, runs down the pine trees so many yards, and what happens when you cut down those pine trees?
Yeah. You hope
You
people
got to have,
remember, because otherwise you stop.
yeah, you have to get a state marker. This pine tree is a marker. Do not cut it down. Yeah.
$500 fine for the person.
Oh, so that's how that. But that's the thing. It's almost a curse. That him and Boone and some of these other Simonkin were so early in settling these places and surveying this land that down the road it ends up just not to say bankrupting them, but being very harmful. They have to deal with all this extra stuff, and they here their whole life has been settling this area, and now they're having to deal with just headache, paperwork, stuff that they don't want to do.
That's right.
Stuff that's not in their bones.
Oh yeah. And there's a guy named Stephen Aran who wrote, a historian who wrote How the West Was Lost, and it's actually about Kentucky, and it's about that transition from pioneer to settlement town. And as you said, it's not an easy one for a lot of guys.
Now, before we get into our, I guess, final stage, Boone and Harrod, I feel like at the beginning definitely had a pretty good relationship, but it definitely soured. Did it remain that way? I mean, is that kind of the, I guess, accepted thought? Or
Yeah, that is one of the great questions that I would love to know the answer to, because there's so little documentation between the two after that. And I think it's primarily because Harrod, once he settles down, Harrod rarely strays from Boiling Springs and Harrodsburg. And even looking at the town minutes for Harrodsburg, Harrod doesn't appear overly active. He does his duty, but he's not overly active. Boone, of course, ends up creating Boone Station a little ways east of Boonesboro, and then he ends up in the Greenbrier country and stuff as he moves out of Kentucky for a period. So outside of a couple of land documents where we know there was a dispute over some property, we don't get a glimpse of that. And I have a feeling that relationship sort of just withered on the vine. And I would like to think they made up, but there's really no evidence that things progressed beyond that.
Yeah, in our own minds, they made up. They were friends. They wrote each other.
Yeah. If no one said otherwise, I can believe it. So it's okay.
That's right. Yeah, that's how it goes, and I can understand how. I mean, it seems like even like you said earlier, Boone didn't want to have to confront Harrod. He's like, I don't, this isn't going to go good, and those signs of just, I guess, a friction are definitely there. So Harrod's lived a good, full, long life for the times, definitely. He's made his claim on Kentucky, but Kentucky becomes a state in 1792. But the same year, Harrod dies, or is presumed dead.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to figure out. It's one of the most bizarre stories in pioneer history in Kentucky, because it goes down something like it's the winter of 1772, the very beginning, January, somewhere around there. he's visited by a guy named James Bridges, who Harrod had known in the past. There had been some disagreements with, something in court, that Harrod was either going to testify against him or sue him or something like that. But all that was behind them. And Bridges said, I'm going out to eastern Kentucky to go hunting. And I'd love to have you come with me. You know the land. I know we've had our differences, but all that's behind us. And Harrod, either he's tempted to go just because he needs the break, or he wants to go on another hunt. It's been a little bit. Whatever the reason, his wife is completely opposed to this. She said, this guy hates you. And if you go, there's a good chance you don't come back. So they kind of compromise. They take Michael Stoner with them, who's another pioneer who doesn't get really a lot of talk.
Yeah.
He was there from the beginning. And they're out hunting, and they split up at one point. And they said, well, we'll probably catch more if we go our separate ways. So they split up. A few minutes later, there's a gunshot, and Bridges comes running back to Stoner, and he said, I heard a gunshot. I've seen signs of Indians in the area. I think they got Harrod. And Stoner says, well, let's go find him. Maybe he's wounded. Maybe they didn't hit him. Maybe he fired that shot. And Bridges said, nope, no way. Too dangerous. They'll kill us all. We've got to go back. So they don't look for Harrod. They go back to the settlements. And, sometime later, it's perceived that Harrod must have died because they wait for him. He doesn't come back. And the story has different variants. There are some accounts that say Harrod was looking for Swift Silver Mine. That would be awesome. That would be a neat, man, what a neat story. There's no real evidence of that. And, if you're Harrod and you go and you find the silver mine, maybe it's land that's not claimed, but it's far away from you. I mean, what are you going to do?
How are you going to get it back?
Yeah. Exactly. And, if it turns out to be on someone else's land, I mean, you've done them a great favor. So the hunting thing sounds more plausible. And I think his wife advocated for that. His son-in-law later, John Fauntleroy, is the guy that puts forth the treasure idea. The problem with that is that people have had is there's not a lot of documentation for James Bridges' existence. There is a James Bridges in Lincoln County. So perhaps that's him. There's some court cases for other counties a little farther east. I personally have gone through there's a book of court cases that were predating statehood at Department for Libraries and Archives. And I went page by page, and I could only find one case between Harrod and James Bridges. And this is several years before, and Harrod loses. And so, if you're James Bridges, you won the case. Why would you murder him?
Yeah.
On the other hand, James Harrod has been through everything at this point. He's in his 50s, and like we said, being in your 50s then is probably equivalent to being in your mid-60s now. Yeah. But, I mean, it's the wintertime. The foliage is off the trees. It's not like you're not going to see a cliff. You've done this before. And the fact that no one finds your body, what happened? And some people have suggested, a wilderness divorce, which is where you just had enough and you choose to start a new life and you just leave. That seems odd. Harrod did write a will not terribly long before the trip. So, that people have suggested that. One person apparently claimed they saw Harrod in Detroit in 1795, which is really curious because Detroit is still in British hands in 1795. So you spend the Revolution fighting the British, and then you hang out with them in Detroit. Yeah. So, and then it could be something as simple as he fell, and the gun went off when he fell, and Bridges was really scared, and they went back. But
there's a lot of controversy, or a lot of conspiracy, I guess you could say, that surrounds it, and which just makes it more and more interesting. Of course, the Swift Silver Mines, just if anybody's wondering, it has to do with some. Was it a Spanish conquistador or something that left a bunch of, or something like that?
I think it's different fables for the time. Jonathan Swift was an English settler, I think, who came early on and then left during the Revolution and came back to the silver mine and couldn't find it when he came back. So the theory was it's lost up there.
Yeah, and there's been many people, I think, that have went to try to find it and stuff, but it's not happened yet, so most likely it's not there.
Yeah, and I think the state's even done like geological studies that say, the ground's not really conducive for silver. So maybe so. It would be awesome, but probably not.
Yeah, not happening. But anyway, a lot of when you think about it's one of those things, I guess, when you think about Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, and James Harrod falls into the same category, of course, and he's had this wonderful Kentucky legacy as far as settling the state, being the first settler. But then his death just kind of puts an earmark on it, I guess, in a way. And you're like, what could have happened if he'd have stayed alive, and then what actually did happen? That how did he die?
Right.
And then you get this thought of if he would have stayed alive a little longer, he would have been able to get his actions down, have a biography written about him. Maybe the same thing with Boone, only, about himself. And we would have known way more about his whole existence and the travels and all those things. But it just didn't happen. And now we're, like you said, we're left in mystery. But that's my thought, I guess, on it. Pretty cool. I mean, pretty cool Kentuckian.
Oh yeah, and his death. I think of it. It's kind of like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died 50 years to the day. To July 4th, the nation's founding, and that seems so symbolic of that passing of that generation on. And I kind of feel that way about Harrod. You're the first guy here with this settlement, and now Kentucky's becoming an honest to goodness state. And just months prior to that going into effect, you waltz off the stage.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good way of putting it. That's just crazy to think. But, well, wild life, or a unique life, I guess. We could go on and on about him, I guess. Anything else that you got that, to talk about him as far as that goes? Anything you'd like to add? His legacy, I guess. What is his legacy? Daniel Boone is so easily glorified, I guess, but where does James Harrod fall? What's his legacy?
The interesting thing about Harrod is his legacy is a quiet one. And again, not besmirching Boone in any way, because what a fantastic Kentuckian who really changed the history of Kentucky. But one of the things that makes Harrod, I think, less attractive to just a layman or someone who's kind of getting interested in Kentucky history is he doesn't get captured by Indians. He doesn't have a lot of the tragedies and things that Boone has. Harrod's life, once he gets here, is fairly, sedentary. And, there is some tragedy. You mentioned the loss of his stepson and that kind of thing. But, Harrod's brothers come and go from Harrodsburg, but none of them, really suffers in the way that Boone's family does. So, his legacy isn't in that excitement, but it's in the hidden things that you find. And so, like, I grew up in Washington County, right next door to Harrodsburg. We went to Harrodsburg for grocery shopping and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But, being a Washington County guy, some of the places here, Glenn's Creek, that I crossed it every morning, taking my son to school. Glenn's Creek is named after Thomas Glenn, who was one of Harrod's men. There are all sorts of waterways and things in the area. The Chaplain River forms the border between Mercer County and Washington County. Abraham Chaplain came with Harrod. And so I would argue, for me, the difference between Harrod and Boone in terms of legacy is Harrod is a leader of men, whereas Boone was also a leader, but Boone's reputation is often Boone. And, when the crunch time came, when push came to shove, Boone had to make the call alone often, whereas Harrod is almost always surrounded. And we see things like the first spinning wheel, the first loom in Kentucky, those were at Fort Harrod. The first school teacher in Kentucky, we mentioned her, Jane Coombs, that's at Fort Harrod. The first sermon preached, there's some debate on that, whether that was at Boonesboro or whether that was at Harrodsburg. I tend to think it was Harrodsburg, but there's some evidence for Boonesboro. But regardless, the first minister, John Lythe, lived in Harrodsburg. So all of these people together make up Harrod's legacy to get the complete picture. He's certainly a crucial part of it. He's the catalyst for it happening, but he is one of many. And I think that makes his legacy different.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, and I think about the video about the top 5 frontiersmen. I think we might need to move James Harrod up to number 2, if not
2, 1. But yeah, we've talked about that. That's my policy coming in. But you're right. Those guys are all, and the way they work together, and even in seeing the Boones show up, and there's references of Harrod at Boonesboro and how these guys work together. I mean, they are all interlaced in each other's legacy.
Yeah, and I think I think your point is the best though, that he was more of a leader in the sense of he came to and established a town and stayed. This was his town. He wanted it to grow. He did the things, bringing in a teacher. And another side note, Jane Coombs was also the first female physician in Kentucky as well.
There you
So
go.
all these interesting things, all these developments. I guess that's the thing. He was connected to building his town, and that required leadership, other people, and so forth. And even with Boonesboro, Boonesboro never became a town because really it was kind of Boone's post to go and explore and do all those sorts of things, the things that he wanted to kind of be part of,
Right.
And I think that's a good difference, I guess, when we think about it. We get caught up in the legend of Daniel Boone and all that, but yeah, that's pretty good, man. That's pretty good. I don't got nothing else to add. I think you good?
I'm good.
I'm good. Well, I enjoyed the talk. I hope people learned. I definitely learned some more. That definitely need to get hold of that biography and check it out because it's good when you get a good biography that goes in a bit more detail than the resources that I've had. But before we go, you can visit Fort Harrod in Harrodsburg. Very nice. Me and my son and nephew and daughter went a few years ago. Something I really enjoyed. Of course, that I enjoyed it more than they did, probably. But
You have that happen too?
yeah. I've shared the story many times, and I'll share it many more. We took a picture when we were leaving, and my nephew and my son had the guns blazing, and they were having a great time, and my daughter was just sitting there on one of the on the monument. I was like, well, that pretty much tells the tale. Yeah, yeah. So, well, anything else before we go?
The only thing is, Harrodsburg is getting ready to turn 250 in 2024. So if anybody who's liked the story of Harrod, definitely visit the fort as soon as you can. And you can not only see the fort, you can see the spring where Harrod and his guys first came that's labeled. There's a little area there you can get out and look around. There's all sorts of historical things in Harrodsburg to see. But, do that as quick as you can. But keep an eye on 2024 because a lot of stuff's going to be happening there, celebrating frontier history as a whole. So,
well, that's very true. That's a good point to bring up. So you got 2 years to prepare. So make your plans. Be in Harrodsburg, 2024. Is it 250 years old? I mean, whew, getting up there.
Yeah.
Getting up there.
Yeah.
Well, David, thanks for coming on again. It's been great talking to you. It is every time. I really enjoyed it, and I learned some stuff too. So it's a win-win. And thanks everybody for listening. And if there's nothing else, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. the Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.